Okay. Hi, Internet. Hi, YouTube. I'm starting a new reaction video. We'll see if it gets doesn't get copyrighted. But I'm right now following Novada Media, uh, independent news group, smaller, much smaller than all the big ones that you probably know of. I've stopped listening to the big ones because, frankly, I just find that they have too much bias, and they tend to just kind of lean into one group or another, and I'm pretty sure they're just kind of like a monopoly. So you know, not to say that monopolies are inherently bad, but it is to say that when it comes to like opinion, I feel like there is a lot of bias that can form. So we're gonna listen. I'm about halfway through this, just listening to this live, and then I'm also playing some chess. So you can enjoy that as well. So let's just keep watching.
complicit in
Here's my
that
game. I'm
crime
getting
itself.
absolutely whooped.
And it's absolutely clear now that what is happening in Gaza.
By the way, I'm not the best chess player. Here's my general opinion as to what's happening right now. By the way, I'm not an expert, right, in really anything as far as I can tell. But what I can say is that I have been spending a lot of time studying World War II, and I like to consider myself a World War II historian. I really don't know how legitimate that is. It's one of those things where it's like, first of all, it's a title. Second of all, I think it's what you make out of it. But I know a lot more about World War II from like the military side of things, not necessarily from like the geopolitical or say the history of war. Right. That's there's two different types of historians. You got military historians, then you got historians of war. I think I lean more into the military history camp, where my focus is really understanding the evolution of the militaries. And then over the years, I've had to expand my knowledge into like other non-military subjects in order to kind of just get some context, because it helps a lot. And I'm coming to realize that in the process, I've been learning a lot about governments. So generally, what I think that's happening right now is the fundamental issue, I think, is that Israel just doesn't actually have the right tool for the job, right? They're using a conventional military to deal with a terrorist threat. And I think, as has been shown time and time again, decade after decade, year after year, really since World War II, by the way. I mean, World War II was one of the last real wars in which a conventional army actually worked. Also, the Korean War, which was much more brief, essentially World War II 2.0, and then a few other conflicts here and there. But the point I'm trying to make is that conventional armies work against conventional enemies. They don't work against a terrorist group. They don't work against groups that are not using conventional tactics. Tanks are designed to destroy enemy infantry. Aircraft are used to destroy enemy armor. Right? You kind of have this rock paper scissors of kind of like a chessboard. You've got just unique pieces that are designed to attack other pieces. Trying to use a conventional army against an enemy that doesn't have a front line necessarily is much messier. So as a result, I think this whole thing that the Western world is saying of supporting Israel's military is a fool's errand, because really, if you want to stop a terrorist group, the way you stop a terrorist group is with the Second Amendment. Okay, you're dealing with a civilian threat. You're basically dealing with individual actors who are, I'm not an expert on this, by the way, but you're essentially dealing with a much smaller organization that can, say, blend into the civilian or come from a civilian population. Think about partisan activity back in World War II. If you want to deal with that, um, you're going to have to use manpower to deal with that. There's no other way to deal with that other than with manpower. And the best manpower you have is a large civilian population. So this whole thing of using technology to stop a conventional or unconventional group, partisan group, you name it, whatever you want to call the Hamas group. I think most people call them a terrorist organization. Uh, yeah, you can't use a conventional army, and so this is kind of starting to mold into just another example of a war in which the civilians become the target of the war, right? I mean, both sides, whichever side you lean into. At this point, I don't really want to pick sides. Whichever side you decide to choose, that is in the wrong here. I think there's mistakes that have been made on both sides, but fundamentally, irrelevant of which side you choose, civilians are going to be the primary target. Okay, and I think about the bombing campaign in World War II. That's probably the closest thing that you sort of get in World War II. Maybe some partisan activity, that sort of thing. So yeah. Anyways, this chess game is going really bad. I was doing really well in the beginning, and then I lost my queen, and it's just been a freaking mess. But I'm gonna just keep playing, not take the game too seriously, and I'm just trying to see if I can try to fix this situation at all. If at all possible, I want to see if I can fix this situation. So I got my 2 knights in the middle. I'm just trying to make them as strong as possible. Anyways, let's continue the video. So yeah, basically, like, I'm about to get checkmated, I'm pretty sure. But basically, you don't expect to destroy a terrorist group with artillery, okay? Another way to put it is don't expect to destroy a group like Hamas using artillery against a civilian region. I mean, that's ridiculous. And you know, it's yeah, I got checkmated there. So I think it's irresponsible. I think it's irresponsible to if the West is going to claim to have the moral high ground here and claim to, you know, like, be decent, I think it's arrogant to say when you are literally. You're literally calibrating your artillery, using the angle and the dimensions. You're using all these measurement methods, and you're literally firing into a city. This is no different than Russia, but just randomly firing into Ukrainian cities. It's literally the same thing, and so it seems very wrong because of that. The other thing I wanted to say about this is, I mean, the death toll. Okay, we're now at a point where the death toll of the Palestinians is higher than that of the Israelis. Okay, and that's not a good look, folks. It's not a good look. You're fighting fire with fire. I don't know what happened here. Yeah, my recording's still going, but basically you're fighting fire with fire. And newsflash, folks, when you fight fire with fire, if you had a burning house and you decided to just, like, throw Molotovs into the house, if you know any basic physics, you know that it's only going to cause more fire. It's not going to put out the heat. So this idea of, you know, tit for tat, you know, you hurt me, I hurt you, that's not taking the steps towards a resolution. That's I think instigating. I think that's instigating hatred. So now I don't really know exactly the whole situation, of course. So I got to be really careful with, like, my sources and whatnot. But I can tell you now, at the very least, irrelevant to the intentions behind all these operations, there could be reasons that I just don't understand for why they're targeting civilian populations with large caliber artillery. But I can certainly tell you that irrelevant of what the reason was, I can certainly say with pretty good confidence. What was I going to say? Hold on, I need a moment to gather my thoughts here. I'm also trying to play chess and watch the news. Bear with me here. That thought slipped my mind for some reason, and unfortunately, we're going to have to see if it comes back. But anyways, let's just continue watching this video and move on from here.
To a war crime because it is disproportionate, and it does not distinguish the targets it is taking out. Hence the terrible number of children that have been killed. And
right. A lot of children are being killed. Both sides have suffered. Both sides are losing families. Okay, bottom line, both sides are losing families.
What we just heard from the World Health Organization and the concerns about the effect of the transfer on the hospitals. But
you will know that
a forced transfer of 1.2 million people is an absolute crime under the laws of war. You are simply not allowed to do it. As indeed is the
just kicking them out.
Punishment of the people of Gaza with the siege and the imposition.
I mean, this has been the issue.
Food and no water. And
this
no
has been the problem from day one. Was that the Palestinians have been losing like property. They never had property rights. And that's a big thing.
Backing up Blunt's assessment of the situation, the International Centre of Justice.
So it's if all civilians in the region were treated equally under law, it would have been a different story.
For Palestinians wrote to Rishi Sunak over the weekend. In their letter, they gave Sunak notice of their intention to prosecute.
But I do think about the bombing campaign in World War II, where basically whether it was the London Blitz or whether it was like the bombing of Dresden by the Royal Air Force, both governments were at war with one another. I don't necessarily think the Palestinians exactly have a government, so that makes things now much more complicated when you don't really have, one side doesn't really have a government, a basic representation under national law. They don't have a country, and so how can they be a member of the UN? They're not even a member of the UN, I don't think. So that's a big issue for the Palestinians. They don't have a government, and so because they don't have a government, they don't have a leading body. It's hard to do diplomacy when they don't have a government. So that's another big issue. But basically, in World War II, you had both governments, both sides, using each other's civilians as the main target. And that's essentially what's happening
UK
now.
government over, quote, their role in providing military, economic and political
It's war crimes on both sides, folks.
support to Israel, which has aided Israel's perpetration of war crimes. In a separate interview on Sky, Blunt went further, accusing the government of complicity in Israeli war crimes.
The government has said that they support Israel's right to defend itself.
Of course, but it
Yeah,
must
Israel's right to defend themselves, but again, shooting the civilians across the border is not self-defense.
international law.
Okay, so where is the complicity here on the part?
Because if you know that a party is going to commit a war crime, and this forcible transfer of people is a precise breach of one of the statutes that governs international law and all states in this area, then you are making yourself complicit. And as international law has developed in this area, the fact of being complicit makes you equally guilty to the party carrying out the crime.
Two things at once.
And this is really this is now the last defense for Palestinians in this situation, is that international law will then begin to operate, make international leaders conscious of their duties under international law, and the fact that in the end, they can't ignore it. And they ought to be acting to restrain our ally from taking actions that are breaches of international law.
So that is what you're warning the Prime Minister, that you're saying that is what he and other government ministers
Well, it goes beyond.
must do.
It goes beyond government ministers. Indeed, any politician.
I mean, I can't. I'm just also thinking too, just like how, it really does feel like the war is a bit of a scam, because I can tell you now, like, it's very difficult to even if Israel were to occupy something like Gaza, and they were to create a police state, an occupation form in which they were able to go door to door and like hunt down Hamas that's hidden amongst the population, you're going to find yourself in a situation where basically you're dealing with that police state. And that's not, sooner or later, I think that they've been trying to do that for many years, and it just hasn't been working. They still haven't successfully defeated Hamas. That's the bottom line here. And the bottom line is that Israel's military is not cut out for the job, and thinking that, sending Israel more guns, more artillery, more aircraft, more tanks is going to fix this problem is foolish. And so this is the problem I have. It's not even so much the actual the actual stance. It's at the very least the tools.
Who is then
They're not using the right tools.
in the turn to Israel on to breach international law and support Israel in the conduct of this operation. Of course, our hearts will go out to the state of Israel and people there for the appalling atrocity committed on it. But what we're not allowed to do is witness one crime being piled on with another, which is simply going to make the situation worse, but it's also fundamentally wrong.
I don't think there are many ordinary members of the British public who watch that and think, oh my God, Crispin Blunt, what an apologist for terror, right? He's making a very principled stance, which I think is very common sense, which is to say, yes, Hamas's atrocities were atrocities. They were terrible. At the same time, you don't pile war crimes on war crimes. A war crime doesn't justify a war crime. He's brave enough to say it. Now, obviously, he's a backbench MP. He's not trying to win a majority at the next general election. But I really don't think that Keir Starmer, Rishi Sunak would be punished by the electorate for saying what Crispin Blunt is saying right there. It is also interesting, actually, that we have seen these sort of legal letters to Sunak and Starmer. Potentially, they are making a difference because their tone has changed this week compared to last week. Also, lots of people actually now saying writing to your MP might be worth it right now. We don't often say, it's probably worth writing to your MP, but I think on this issue, because UK leaders have been so outrageous, I do think that there are lots of right-thinking people who are outraged, and I think it's good to remind your representatives of that. Crispin Blunt isn't the only Tory MP calling for Israel to back away from war crimes either. Now, the current chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Alicia Kearns, told LBC this about Israel's siege of Gaza.
Do you think that Israel should turn back on the water and turn back on the electricity?
Oh, and that's the other thing too. Like, not only are they firing artillery into the place, they're cutting off all the water supplies and electricity supplies. So, in essence, it's a forced migration of the population.
I believe they have to, because they have a duty under international humanitarian law to make sure that people can access medical aid and support. That cannot currently be done. And the Egyptians can't.
And so the thing with the West is that they're all talk, but I'm pretty sure they don't really give enough. That's the sad truth.
Open the
West
Rafah crossing again,
the West
as it's
pretends like they
called,
give
because
enough,
it was
right?
bombarded, it
But
was
they don't.
bombed by Israel.
Actions
They
speak
need
louder
to
than words.
reopen it. The Egyptians have already said that they will take all the humanitarian
We don't.
aid
I don't
people
know.
want to get
I'm a Westerner.
into Gaza. They will take it from their airport, but they need assurances from Israel that no humanitarian convoy will be bombed. This is something the UK can do. We can work with our Israeli partners. We've deployed ships to help them with the risk of transnational terror and support from other terrorist groups around the world. But we can also be a friend and say, let's get the Rafah crossing open, because that's also how we get British nationals out who are stuck in Gaza, particularly the doctors who will have been out there volunteering. We get the humanitarian aid in.
A lot of this could have been avoided if the civilians were armed, right? If the governments were just like to kind of take a break from this. But no, unfortunately, here we are.
But no one else can switch back on water apart from the Israelis. And they do have a duty to, I believe, under international humanitarian law, because they control the airspace of Gaza, they control the coastal access, and they have blockaded it. And so, in effect, I believe that they have that duty.
Again, a completely common sense position. And I suppose because these are backbench MPs, senior backbench MPs, they chair the relevant committee, but they're not constantly focus grouping their answers. I assume with Keir Starmer, that's what's going on. They're focus grouping their answers. I mean, I think with him, it's actually that he's terrified of the people who called Labour anti-Semitic beforehand. Now he wants to sort of say, no, definitely, we're 100% backing Israel. He also wants to distinguish himself from Jeremy Corbyn. But in any case, when the stakes are this high, I find that quite despicable. Let's go to Cairns again, because speaking on the Newsagents podcast, she made this wider point.
Israel has to defeat Hamas,
Yeah, I
not
agree with
just
her.
in the interest of the people of Israel, but actually the wider region. But that is therefore difficult, because what you don't want to be seen to be is somehow not supportive of Israel, particularly
Right.
given all that they have been through.
There's a lot of political baggage with Israel, and that's just really the bottom line. I mean, the Western world is a Judeo-Christian world, and so there's a lot of like historical, cultural, if not religious reasons for why the West cares about Israel. And so, when you look at how Israel was even created to begin with, this was in the aftermath of World War II. This was in the aftermath of the Holocaust. And that's essentially Israel's stance, is they're basically saying F to the Holocaust. We will never be Holocausted again. Anyone who remotely says death to Jews in any capacity, we need to be armed to the teeth. The part I didn't understand is if you want your Israelis to be armed to the teeth, why don't you have a Second Amendment in your country? Why is it that only the military is armed? Why not arm your civilians too? You would have two armies basically. You would have a main army and a home front. Look at Switzerland, right? And whatever program they have to keep their they have a powerful reserve. So that's the thing that's sort of odd. It's like there's just no way that Hamas should have succeeded, frankly. Given how much money Israel had, I think Israel, once again, I just think the Israeli government and all the Western technology has failed to actually protect the civilians of Israel, right? Let alone the civilians of Palestine. And so if all the soldiers, if people were armed, man, they would have been able to fight anyone who was attacking.
Also have a duty to give those difficult messages, to say that humanitarian law is not something you opt in and out of, and that we have a duty as Britain to be tough with our friends and put those messages across.
But that's the point, isn't it? Because can it be right? It is clear, as you say, Hamas wants to wipe Israel off the map. But it cannot be right that in response to that, Israel wipes Gaza off the map.
Yeah.
Right.
And this is the problem. This is a counter-terrorism operation. I think it's really important that that's how we should be talking about it. This isn't a war on Palestine. This has to be a counter-terrorism operation, which is difficult. You know, Hamas is hiding out amongst civilians, but we've dealt with that in the past.
What do you make of the fact that these two Tory backbenchers are sort of speaking the most sense of, I think, anyone in the House of Commons at the moment?
Well, thank God for them, Michael. I think it's pretty extraordinary. And thank God they're not Labour MPs. Because, of course, if they were, then there would be cause for them to lose the whip. And for Keir Starmer...
So the silver lining, folks, is that the West is talking about it, okay? I mean, I think for the first time, it really feels like the first time in a long time, the Western world is actually sort of waking up to what's happening out there. Unfortunately, the situation had to get so bad for us to finally start paying attention. But if there's a time for you to make a vote, you know, if you want to really, you know, flex the muscles of democracy that the Western world claims is its most powerful tool, perhaps it is. This is the time to do it. This is why I'm doing
to remove them. They have no place.
We need the people to talk. We don't need the governments to talk anymore. We need the people to talk. But the real question is who's speaking for the people, right? And if that voice is not aligned with what the people are saying or what the people are believing, then there's a disconnection there between the people of the world and the governments of the world, and so you end up having these governments or these higher bodies fighting each other, fighting a war, but they're using the masses of the people as like the source of momentum to fight. No way. That's
in the public conversation.
That's not
because you're in the Conservative Party, where there is actually, when it comes to the internal party operation, a measure of democracy. There is not such a centralisation of power that you can just get rid of people willy-nilly. When they did, like under Boris Johnson in 2019, it caused a furore. You know, it happened, but there was an uproar. When it happens in Labour, you know, the media cheer it on. I think actually this really underscores the importance of not having over-centralisation at Westminster, not allowing the party leaders of our two main parties to effectively become demigods and determine who can say what, where, and when. And that's because sometimes both parties have a consensus on an issue, like with Iraq, like here right now with Gaza, in terms of supporting Israel and committing frankly war crimes. They're both wrong. The problem with the two-party system is, Michael,
they're both wrong.
That doesn't really leave much space for dissenting voices. Dissenting voices can be right. And so when you have two parties, you need to also have a culture and an acceptance of the fact that the two leaders won't always make the right calls. And this idea that you have just two parties and that the leaders are effectively presidential-style figures is really anti-democratic, not undemocratic, anti-democratic.
I agree.
So thank God for these two people. And I'll say this again, it would be inconceivable for a Labour MP to be involved in efforts to potentially charge leading politicians, including the Prime Minister, with aiding and abetting war crime, which is precisely what is happening with the Conservative MP right now. So thank goodness for them. But I also think this really highlights the problems of what our media class has been calling for in Labour, which is give Keir Starmer all the power, that makes him electable, that's the only way Labour can do politics if they want to be grown up, and bugger the rest, bugger the backbenchers, no dissent. You know, they have to toe the line or they're out. It's not.
So in a real sense, this is not just an issue with Israel and Palestine. This is an issue with the Western world's so-called democratic process. It really may not be all that democratic. And what we're seeing is a disconnection between what our governments are saying versus what the people are saying. And so that's what I think he's kind of getting at, and I agree. And so thank goodness for the internet too, because I think the internet has at least opened up the channels, but it's a tool. And the tool is only going to be effective if you put it to good use. So this is why we're making the video.
Not good for Labour, it's not good for the country.
Let's move on to Labour, because those messages you just heard calling for de-escalation and respect for international law from senior backbench Tories are the kind of thing you would, in theory, hope to hear from Labour. But instead, both Keir Starmer and Shadow Attorney General Emily Thornberry have refused to condemn Israel's actions in Gaza, with Starmer even saying Israel has the right to withhold power and water from the Strip. And ahead of Palestinian solidarity protests that took place across the UK at the weekend, the party sent this letter to its local Labour Party groups. They said, there will be a number of protests and demonstrations taking place over the weekend. Elected representatives have been given strong advice not to attend any of these events, and I would urge you to exercise similar caution. Not only is this in the interest of our members' safety, but also to avoid placing colleagues in a position where they may share a platform with or are close to individuals that threaten to undermine the values and principles of the Labour Party. I'm not sure why it would be, for individuals' safety. Now, I was actually away this weekend, so I didn't go to the Palestine demo, but many of my friends did, many of my colleagues did. And I haven't heard from any of them that it was a particularly dangerous place. I mean, I did see one video on Twitter that looked somewhat unpleasant, but I mean, there are 150,000 people on this demo, so the idea it was dangerous to attend seems a little bit counterintuitive to me. On the BBC, Shadow Foreign Secretary David Lammy gave this justification for that advice to elected officials.
It's important that as we face and want to be the next government, that people do not share platforms with people who do not share Labour values, that they're careful and cautious. And we've seen Labour members of Parliament exercise that caution over the last few days, and I think that must be right.
So are you saying, because again, I want to be clear, if you're a Labour MP or Labour councillor, you shouldn't go, for example, to a pro-Palestinian rally?
If you're a Labour MP, you should always be careful whom you share platforms with at this moment, and you should be very careful that you do nothing to drive division in our communities.
Okay.
There's a rise in anti-Semitism, there's a rise in Islamophobia in our country as I speak.
And are you saying,
as an MP,
just so
in a
clear,
position of responsibility, you do everything to minimize those who would sow division.
And are you saying they can't go to a pro-Israel rally?
Guidance has gone out. It's very clear what that guidance is. People have a right to protest in our country. It's a right we defend because we're a democracy, just as we defend the rule of law and international law. So people have the right to protest.
Okay.
But we as leaders in our community should be very judicious and careful, I think, at this time. That's the right thing to do, and it's particularly the right thing to do if you hope one day to be the government.
Listen to in isolation, right? I do agree with that statement, but it doesn't disagree. Sorry, I do disagree with that statement, listen to in isolation, but it doesn't, disgust me. What disgusts me is listening to that statement with the knowledge of what the Labour Party have been saying over the past week, right? So if you were really concerned with community cohesion and not being seen to take a side and sort of bringing people together, you would say, yes, what we saw in Israel is tragic. Those attacks on civilians were despicable. Also, what we are seeing in Gaza is disgusting, and attacks on civilians are despicable. Instead, what we've seen, and we've been talking about this over the past week, we've put out videos on this, you've had Keir Starmer asked, do you have any thoughts at all about Gaza? And he said, oh, no one wants to see this, but I 100% stand in solidarity with Israel, who have a right to defend themselves. Labour have been taking sides. There is no way that anyone could possibly argue that they have been somewhat judicious in terms of siding with one side or another in what is a very long conflict, war, oppression, occupation. Now we're seeing, the collective punishment of a lot of people, and a lot of people for whom, their destiny matters a lot to members of the British public. Right now, you can talk about it in terms of religious or ethnic communities. Obviously, on that demo, you've got people from all different sorts of backgrounds. There are a lot of people in the country who care about the Palestinians, who care about the Gazans. And I think it was pretty goddamn divisive for Keir Starmer to tour the studios last week. David Lammy did it as well, and basically said, we don't give a damn about these Gazans, right? Turn off their water, yeah, go for it. Israel has a right to defend itself. Turn off their electricity, go for it. Israel has a right to defend themselves. Do you oppose?
So turning off water against the civilian population does not sound like self-defense, folks.
It doesn't. Civilian flats. Well, war is messy, right? That is not a judicious response, which gives due respect to the fact that this is a highly charged issue in this country, which has the potential to divide communities, right? And if you don't want to divide communities, the thing you don't do is side entirely with one and dismiss the other, which is what the Labour leadership have done over the past week or so. Now, as far as we're aware, not a single Labour MP turned up to any of those protests. I mean, we might be wrong, but it doesn't seem as if they did. Other elected Labour officials have shown a bit more backbone, though. Shaista Aziz and Amal Latif were Labour councillors for Oxford until this weekend when they resigned. They said this: "We are deeply disappointed and alarmed at the Labour Party, or the Labour Party leader, Keir Starmer's comments, seeming to condone the use of collective punishment against the people of Gaza in direct contravention of international law. We have sought to seek urgent clarification regarding these statements from both the national and local leadership. Unfortunately, as no clarification has been forthcoming, we have made a conscious decision to immediately resign the whip and leave the Labour Party." In Stroud, Labour councillor Jesse Hoskin has also quit over Starmer's comments, saying this: 2 million Palestinians in Gaza who had nothing to do with Hamas's actions should not be punished collectively for it. We are witnessing atrocities. I have not had the support of other Stroud district Labour councillors in unequivocally distancing myself from comments made by Keir Starmer.
So the political camping, that's the thing about any group. Oh, look, Black resign. Okay. Nice, another win. We're doing pretty well. I think we're like 2-1 right now.
And senior shadow ministers supporting war crimes against Palestinian people. In his BBC interview, Lamy was given an opportunity to condemn Israel for the forced transfer of Gazans to the south of the territory.
Do you support the order to move them or not?
The order to move them? Well, clearly.
Just yes or no?
It's not a yes or no, Victoria. I'm hoping one day to be Foreign Secretary and a Chief Diplomat, so it's not a yes or no.
Why not? Why not?
Can I answer the question?
Please.
Very simply. This is a war situation. War is ugly.
Yes.
Very, very sadly, people die. We have rules, and those rules mean
those rules have been broken.
Minimize death. Now you know, and I know, because Netanyahu has said that there will be an invasion shortly.
I mean, what rules? The rule of not targeting civilian populations with artillery. The rule of not, in fact, doing the exact opposite of providing aid to civilians, but actually taking away their water supply. So those are already two rules that I can say have been broken.
Against that backdrop, of course,
but I'm getting emotional.
That civilians must not be in harm's way, and an order has been issued. I'm glad that order has been extended. Of course, I am. But the point I want to get across is that it's hugely important that we minimise the loss of human life.
Right.
And anyone seeing those scenes
about
from
international
Gaza,
humanitarian
it's
law.
horrendous for those people that are facing that at this point in time.
The UN Human Rights Commissioner says the imposition of sieges that endanger the lives of civilians is prohibited under international humanitarian law. Keir Starmer, your leader, a human rights lawyer, says Israel does have the right to impose a siege. Who is right?
In situations of war, where there are allegations of war crimes, that must ultimately be a matter for the UN and its agencies and for the ICC. I'm sorry, Victoria, that is the case. This is not a moment for me to pass
the responsibility. So he's not taking responsibility. Okay, so he's just passing it on to someone else. Sorry, it's like when you try to get you try to get some paperwork done in some large bureaucracy, and they're like, sorry, no, you have to go to the other department. Please go to the other department because that's off my hands. I can't help you. That's just, I can't help you there, bud. Sorry, you're gonna have to go to the other department, and then you're just playing this thing of just like pinball, and you're just like no one has authority, and all of a sudden, all these rules and all these regulations, no one can make the final decision, right? And so he's not taking responsibility. That's all it is.
War crimes, and neither was the UN Human Rights Commissioner. He was saying it's breaking international law to impose a siege. It's not just.
This is why I don't recommend watching TV, folks, because you just have dumb people on. You just have dumb people on TV, and it's just meant to be entertainment. Look at this background. Like, what is this? What is this background going? Why do you need this fancy stage just to have an interview? 60 Minutes was pretty humble about it. Here, look at this. This is too much.
It's up to you.
It's just entertainment.
It's not
just
just
entertainment.
breaking international law
Yeah,
to impose.
emotional and-
It's not just. It's not a view. It's not just plucked an opinion out of the air. He's looking at the framework, the Geneva Conventions. He says the imposition of sieges, which endangers the lives of.
By the way, the Geneva Convention in War II is a joke.
Civilians is prohibited under international humanitarian law. Keir Starmer says Israel has a right to impose a siege.
I don't.
Who is right?
Keir Starmer has said right from the beginning that any war, it's important that democracies uphold the rules-based order.
Yeah, so this is the problem with democracies. They like to have wars without declaring wars. This is exactly what happened with Vietnam. Okay, one of the reasons why the United States, failed at Vietnam is because they actually did not send an occupying force. They sent a defense force into southern Vietnam to defend against the guerrilla groups that were essentially attacking the so-called Charlie that was attacking southern Vietnam. But keep in mind that northern Vietnam was like North Korea in the sense that it had its own sovereign government and there was a border there. But the thing is, in this war, you had this war where you had these guerrilla groups fighting, and they recruited anybody they could get their hands on, and they would use any source of manpower or tool of propaganda they could get their hands on to create a functional army. And so if it meant going to a village and taking civilians and recruiting even children into the army, so be it. Their goal was to dislodge. They wanted Vietnamese independence, and they didn't want anybody involved. And so eventually, once the United States pulled out, southern Vietnam did fall. Right, the southern Vietnamese democratic government, it was actually a republic, did fall. In fact, you could see I did a little Let's Play when I was playing Rising Storm 2 the other night, and literally they were Vietnamese. So the point I'm trying to make is that it's been the history throughout the 20th century and post-World War II that democratic republics wage war, but they just don't declare war. They instead wage limited wars. And limited wars become infinite wars in game theory. And essentially you have a fight where, there's no end in sight until the last freaking revolutionary is killed. And good luck when each and every time civilians are killed in the process, those revolutionary groups can use their own local propaganda to further expand the recruitment. It's like gangs, right? In the same sense as like gangs and cops. It's like using cops to fix the ghetto. It's the same. It's essentially the same problem. It's an undeclared war, and so this is only going to end when the hearts of the people have changed, and when you have governments that actually represent what the people actually want. Right now, we don't have that.
And that must be within international law.
So all these rules, but the rules are broken because the fundamental rule in war is that there are none.
Simply
from the beginning.
Except for nuclear bombs, maybe.
I'm simply asking
mutual destruction is the only rule that seems to be consistent because it is constrained by the fear of one's own death. That's the only reason why. If Russia could have used nuclear bombs and not suffer the consequences, chances are they would have done so by now, right?
People should have access.
Just in a pure analysis game theory perspective.
To you, Victoria, I'm not here as an international lawyer, order, and that must be within international law.
And I'm simply asking
from the beginning. His statement today says that people should have access.
He's not listening. He's pulling out a flashcard. And
said to you, Victoria, I'm not here as an international lawyer. That is a determinant of the UN and its agencies. And
so he's passing up the responsibility higher up to higher bureaucracy in which is going to sit there under debate and discussion for decades and is never going to be resolved.
The ICC is not a determinant of international law.
Sorry, I want to see what he did here. So it's a mess. This man does not have my respect right now.
And you should be very careful.
I think
you do.
He's just a spokesperson
to drive division.
I don't know. I'm gonna start. I'll describe someone like him as just a flashcarder. Memorized a bunch of lines and went on TV, doing it because he doesn't want to lose his job. And I don't despise the man for losing his job, but it's clear that his priorities are vectored somewhere else. They're not focused on the problem at hand. They're focused on what he has to say to maintain his job. And this is part of the Moloch in game theory.
Communities.
Okay.
There's a rise in anti-Semitism. There's a rise in Islamophobia in our country. As I
local short-term priorities lead to long-term disadvantages, basically.
And are you saying,
as an MP,
and just so I'm clear,
or another way to see it is micro solutions leads to macro problems.
Responsibility.
Can lead to macro.
You do everything to minimize.
Micro decision making can lead to macro issues, especially if all the building blocks, all the pawns on the board, he's a pawn, by the way, all the pawns on the board are literally doing the same thing. At some point, you're going to have a general phenomenon, like in thermodynamics. This is essentially the same problem, okay? You had all these people thinking too short term because his priority is, again, on his job, the same way that this pawn's priority is to secure the center of the board, okay? And as a result of that, this pawn may actually make me lose the game if all the pawns are just prioritizing controlling the immediate square, and we're not actually working as like a whole team, right? There's a disconnection. That's what I'm trying to say. Anyways,
who would sow division.
And are you saying they can't go to a pro-Israel rally?
Guidance has gone out. It's very clear what that guidance is. People have a right to protest in our country. It's a right we defend because we're a democracy, just as we defend the rule of law and international law. So people have the right to protest.
I just made a blunder.
We as leaders in our community should be very judicious and careful, I think, at this time. That's the right thing to do, and it's particularly the right thing to do if you hope one day to be the government.
Listen to in isolation, right? I do agree with that statement, but it doesn't disagree. Sorry, I do disagree with that statement.
So
in
I
isolation, but it doesn't,
back.
Disgust me. What disgusts me is listening to that statement with the knowledge of what the Labour Party have been saying over the past week. Right? So if you were really concerned with community cohesion and not being seen to take a side and sort of bringing people together, you would say, yes, what we saw in Israel is tragic. Those attacks on civilians were despicable. Also, what we are seeing in Gaza is disgusting. Attacks on civilians are despicable. Instead, what we've
this
seen,
guy, like his energy is getting me emotional.
Put out videos on this. You've had Keir Starmer asked, "Do you have any thoughts at all about Gaza?" And he said, "Oh, no one wants to see this, but I 100% stand in solidarity with Israel, who have a right to defend themselves." Labour have been taking sides. There is no way that anyone could possibly argue that they have been somewhat judicious in terms of siding with one side or another in what is a very long conflict, war, oppression, occupation. Now we're seeing, the collective punishment of a lot of people, and a lot of people for whom, their destiny matters a lot to members of the British public. Right now, you can talk about it in terms of religious or ethnic communities. Obviously, on that demo, you've got people from all different sorts of backgrounds. There are a lot of people in the country who care about the Palestinians, who care about the Gazans. And I think it was pretty goddamn divisive for Keir Starmer to tour the studios last week. David Lammy did it as well, and basically said, we don't give a damn about these Gazans, right? Turn off their water, yeah, go for it. Israel has a right to defend itself. Turn off their electricity, go for it. Israel has a right to defend themselves. Do you oppose?
No, they're not even commenting. They're not even commenting on that. They're like, I don't know. I don't know what they haven't commented on that. And it's because they're like,
well, war is messy.
They're avoiding the problem, right?
That is not a judicious.
So.
Response, which gives due respect to the fact that this is a highly charged issue in this country, which has the potential to divide communities, right? And if you don't want to divide communities, the thing you don't do is side entirely with one and dismiss the other, which is what the Labour leadership have done over the past week or so. Now, as far as we're aware, not a single Labour MP turned up to any of those protests. I mean, we might be wrong, but it doesn't seem as if they did. Other elected Labour officials have shown a bit more backbone, though. Shaista Aziz and Amal Latif were Labour councillors for Oxford until this weekend when they resigned. They said this: "We are deeply disappointed and alarmed at the Labour Party, or the Labour Party leader, Keir Starmer's comments, seeming to condone the use of collective punishment against the people of Gaza in direct contravention of international law. We have sought to seek urgent clarification regarding these statements from both the national and local leadership. Unfortunately, as no clarification has been forthcoming, we have made a conscious decision to immediately resign the whip and leave the Labour Party." In Stroud, Labour councillor Jesse Hoskin has also quit over Starmer's comments, saying this: 2 million Palestinians in Gaza who had nothing to do with Hamas's actions should not be punished collectively for it. We are witnessing atrocities. I have not had the support of other Stroud district Labour councillors in unequivocally distancing myself from comments made by Keir Starmer and senior shadow ministers supporting war crimes against Palestinian people. In his BBC interview, Lammy was given an opportunity to condemn Israel for the forced transfer of Gazans to the south of the territory.
Do you support the order to move them or not?
The order to move them? Well, clearly.
Just yes or no?
It's not a yes or no, Victoria. I'm hoping one day to be Foreign Secretary and a Chief Diplomat, so it's not a yes or no.
Why not? Why not?
Can I answer the question?
Please.
Very simply. This is a war situation. War is ugly.
Yes.
Very, very sadly, people die. We have rules, and those rules mean that you must minimize death. Now, you know, and I know, because Netanyahu has said that there will be an invasion shortly. Against that backdrop, of course it's right that civilians must not be in harm's way, and an order has been issued. I'm glad that that order has been extended, of course I am, but the point I want to get across is that it's hugely important that we minimize the loss of human life.
Right.
But yeah, so his point is true, but his observations are false. And I think that's the underlying problem. Oh man, I'm just making some pretty bad moves right now. I'm about to lose a bishop, which is pretty inconvenient for me. Yeah, no, we'll take.
Let's talk about international humanitarian
It's horrendous for those people that are facing that at this point in time.
The UN Human Rights Commissioner says the imposition of sieges that endanger the lives of civilians is prohibited under international humanitarian law. Keir Starmer, your leader, a human rights lawyer.
Oh, so she came prepared. She actually brought out the rules of the war in front of him that he spoke of, and she pointed out that the sieges are...
Says Israel does have the right to impose a siege. Who is right?
In situations of war, where there are allegations of war crimes, that must ultimately be a matter for the UN and its agencies and for the ICC. I'm sorry, Victoria, that is the case. This is not a moment for me to pass judgment about whether I'm not here as a lawyer.
And neither was the UN Human Rights Commissioner. He was saying it's breaking international law to impose a siege. It's not just a view. It's not just plucked an opinion out of the air. He's looking at the framework, the Geneva Conventions. He says the imposition of sieges, which endangers the lives of civilians, is prohibited under international humanitarian law. Keir Starmer says Israel has a right to impose a siege. Who is right?
Keir Starmer has said right from the beginning that any war, it's important that democracies uphold the rules-based order, and
they're not. They're doing
that must be within international law.
And I'm
said
simply
that from the
asking
beginning.
you.
His statement today says that people should have access. And I have said to you, Victoria, I'm not here as an international lawyer. That is a determination of the UN and its agencies and the ICC. It's not a determination for me.
Well, the UN did say that a siege breaks international law. It's collective punishment, right? It was a very, very cowardly answer, I think. And the reason I say that is this. He says, oh, if war crimes are committed, that's something for an international tribunal. Now, an international tribunal, that's going to happen. Well, it probably will never happen because it always gets blocked by the United States, who are a Security Council member. And so it's never the case that Israel does go to the ICC. But even if it were, that would be a long way down the line. Now, you are a politician. You have influence right now. It's no good to say, oh, yeah, it could be a war crime, might be. Who knows? I've got nothing to say about this. We'll leave it to the lawyers in a few years' time. You are a very high-profile politician. You can intervene in the present. You can't say, oh, this is something, we'll work it all out down the line. No, this is happening right now. You have influence. Do something with that influence. It's just so pathetic. And, to see that sort of dismissive attitude towards something which the UN is saying, it's very Tony Blair, right? It was the Labour Party, let's not forget, who went to Iraq. You know, one of the things I thought about Keir Starmer, actually, he was against the Iraq war, he was a human rights lawyer. I was like, yeah, he's not going to stand up to vested interests, but presumably he's not going to be so wantonly addicted to the idea of international intervention and so dismissive of international norms and just, you know, a lackey to the US. Presumably he'd be have a little bit more backbone. I can't imagine him have really been any worse in this situation, right? Can you imagine in that Keir Starmer leadership election to Labour members, if people had been told that, oh, imagine you're in this situation where the Israelis have turned off the entire water supply to the Gaza Strip and are blockading any energy so their desalination plants don't work. Keir Starmer says, yeah, fine with that. Like he is as bad as New Labour now when it comes to international politics, which is just, I mean, incredibly depressing as a situation. And the International Centre of Justice for Palestinians has written to Keir Starmer as well as to the Prime Minister, Emily Thornberry and David Lammy as well. They say this morning, ICJP issued Keir Starmer, Emily Thornberry and David Lammy with a notice of intention to prosecute UK politicians for their role in aiding and abetting Israel's perpetration of war crimes. ICJP demands that the Labour Party leadership and UK politicians more broadly must call for an immediate ceasefire, call for an end to Israel's illegal siege and evacuation order for North Gaza, condemn Israel's war crimes and crimes against humanity. They should then press the government into immediate action to do the same. Aaron, it's pretty depressing, this, isn't it? I mean, they do sound a lot like New Labour in the run-up to the Iraq War.
Entirely, Mike. Entirely. And it's something we've talked about a lot. You know, you really cannot underprice the possibility of a Labour government under Keir Starmer taking this country into some kind of conflict after 2024. Domestically, I think it's inarguable that Labour is a better bet than the Tories. Don't have to be particularly transformational to think that. You might think they might administer decline slightly better. Fine. I mean, I think that's probably what would be the case. But on foreign policy, it's perfectly possible that a Labour government is far more hawkish and ties itself far more closely to what the American government wants, what the State Department wants, and the demands of the so-called Western Alliance. That is highly likely. And so it's important right now, I think, for the left, and including people inside the Labour Party, to get on top of that, to get ahead of it. Because otherwise, yes, you may see something like a repeat of Iraq. You could. Because remember, of course, we're living in a time now, the second half of the 2020s, where we're seeing the return of great power politics. We're seeing the rise of China, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, ethnic cleansing in Nagorno-Karabakh, the detente between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and now, of course, Israel and Iran too. So it's an incredibly volatile moment geopolitically. And what's become clear to me over the last week, really, is the inability of Labour, particularly its leadership, to deal with these things seriously. Everything Keir Starmer does, or David Lammy does, is for domestic consumption and to appease press barons and to appeal to the financial lobby in this country. So they want to get big money donors, big corporates, be seen as a safe pair of hands for the UK defence exports industry and for its military and US armed forces.
One move from
to hell with what's right, to hell with what most people in this country actually want, and to hell with, you know, actually even Britain's foreign policy interests, frankly.
Oh man!
Because if you look at what's happened over the last week,
I lose my queen, my offensive
the
power is
unflinching
gone.
support that's come from the EU, the UK, and the United States for Israel in regards to what it's doing in Gaza, and not in regards to the 1,200 people who were killed, but in regards to what's happening in Gaza, has completely undermined their diplomatic efforts regarding Ukraine and elsewhere over the course of the last 3 years. Because if you're a middle-class Ukrainian, Taiwanese, you look at this, what's going on in Gaza, and your conclusion is quite simple. The United States, the EU, and the UK believe in might is right. In other words, when push comes to shove, we haven't got a chance. And so I don't really understand it in terms of its own internal coherence.
I mean,
and I think it shows how
politically myopic. If the West, if any Western nation were to declare war now, they would just. I mean, they wouldn't even deploy the right units for the war. They're not going to deploy the manpower. They're not going to force a draft. Is what I'm trying to say.
Important questions on foreign policy. You know, I don't think they're myopic and stupid on the country. I disagree with them, but I don't think they're going to arrive at a political settlement which is more destructive.
Here's lost.
On foreign policy, that is most certainly the case.
Zippy Hotovely is the Israeli ambassador to
Pay
the
attention.
UK. She has spoken to Sky News and given one of the most chilling interviews I've ever seen.
What's the view on the
boy.
humanitarian crisis in Gaza this morning?
There is no humanitarian crisis because
There isn't.
There is no. Israel is in charge of the safety of the Israelis. Hamas is in charge of the safety of the Palestinians.
There
Oh, boy.
is no humanitarian crisis in Gaza, and Hamas is responsible for the safety of Palestinians. Now, Israeli bombs
I kind of see her point in a way, like it's like this is my business, this is your business, but the line's been crossed, folks. So
have already killed almost 800 children in Gaza. Israel has shut off running water to 2 million people in Gaza. Israel has also shut off the electricity supply, meaning the desalination plants can't function, so there's no other way to get water in Gaza. Journalists, medics, and UN workers are being killed. Yet there's no humanitarian crisis. No humanitarian crisis.
I just lost.
This is
I'm
not a
paying
fringe
attention, man. I'm making
pundit. This is the
terrible
Israeli
videos.
ambassador to the UK. This is the representative of the Israeli government
surrender.
to the
I hurt
UK
myself.
who is saying there is no humanitarian crisis.
Let's just finish this
in
video.
Gaza.
I'm just sick of
Completely
it.
sick. And it actually gets worse.
We've been showing pictures this morning that would illustrate that there is a humanitarian crisis in Gaza.
Can I ask you something?
Yeah.
Are you a mother?
Yes.
What would you think if your children would have been executed in front of your eyes? Would you expect your government?
Oh, she's the Israel. Oh man, she's the Israeli ambassador. Okay, it's one thing for her to be like some lady, but it's another thing for her to be the Israeli ambassador. Ugh. I'm telling you, the Israeli government, man, I think they've gone through some sort of corruption. I'll say it. They've gone through some sort of corruption at this point. And I think if I had to guess where it came from, it's the fear. It's the
To
anti-Holocautism.
think about those Nazis committing those crimes and to
See?
say, wait a second, first of all, we need to protect the enemy, and then to protect my children. Your children come as priority to your prime minister.
Does the Israeli ambassador not think that Palestinians also have children? Right? Are there not Palestinian mothers who care deeply about their kids? Or is Zippy Hotovely suggesting every man, woman, and child in Gaza is a Nazi?
When Israelis speak like that, they're making it sound like the Palestinians aren't people. Because if you're trying to be logical about it, right?
That's the language of genocide. No, when Vladimir Putin says that kind of thing, our whole media rightly says that's the language of genocide. When he says Ukrainians are Nazis, so they're fair game, we think that's the language of genocide, and the mainstream media thinks that's the language of genocide. When an Israeli ambassador says it, that's normal. That's normal. That's sickening. That's disgusting. Let's go to another moment in the interview.
How do we get here?
Never in the past we had such a clear-cut war of good versus evil, of people that are slaughtering babies versus people that are protecting their children in a shelter.
Yeah, and the saddest part is you can't even tell who's slaughtering who. That's the saddest part. But right now, there's
Everyone
more.
saw the
If you
Israeli
want to play the
parents
numbers game, if that's of any meaning to anyone, there's more dead Palestinians than Israelis. Okay?
protecting the children into shelters, and everyone saw the horrific footages of those beheaded babies, this horrors that created by Hamas terrorists.
Yeah, but the Hamas, man, I mean, they definitely scared the living F out of Israel.
So this is such a clear-cut war.
Now, we haven't all seen footage of babies being beheaded, right? No international media outlet has confirmed it happened. Now, massacres did happen. Obviously, massacres did happen.
I mean, I'm
It's not a
gonna assume
question,
that they did.
if
Okay, I'm gonna
no
assume
babies
that
were
they
beheaded,
did.
that means what
if
Hamas
it's anything
did was
like
fine.
ISIS,
Absolutely.
if it was anything like ISIS, I mean, I'm not surprised.
Absolutely not. But if you are the Israeli ambassador, right, then when you are going on the television, you should say stuff which is verified, which has evidence. You can't just go on there and say, everyone has seen this, when no one has seen this, right? Well, maybe someone in the world has seen it, I don't know, but no international media is verified.
I don't think he's even making a good point. I mean, I get his point. I would just say, like, no, just cut and paste her argument, but replace Israelis with Palestinians, and all of a sudden her argument totally
Which means
collapses.
that I've got no reason to think it's true, right? It's also true. She says Israeli mothers were protecting their babies in shelters. That was awful. These
Just
are
change the
awful
adjective.
things. I have every sympathy for Israeli mothers sheltering their kids in shelters. Does Zippy Hotovely not think Palestinian mothers also protect their babies when they are being attacked?
See,
Right?
you're
It's not
using
just
too much
Israelis
logic there,
protecting
man.
their babies. They're also
You're using too much
Palestinians
logic.
protecting their babies.
How dare you?
Right? They're less likely to have shelters, in fact. And they are being bombed by one of the most powerful militaries in the world. Day after day after day after
Not
day.
powerful enough
Again,
to
remember,
stop
this
Hamas.
isn't just a fringe
That's
pundit.
the thing that's so ironic. One of the most powerful militaries in the world still couldn't stop the Hamas from crossing the border.
On right-wing TV, this is Israel's official representative to the UK. Now, I want to just show one more answer from Potter Levy, as it really shows how the Western powers are implicated in Israel's callous attitude towards Palestinians in Gaza. She's asked about what peace might look like, and she says this.
The only solution that is at the moment at the table is the safety of the children of Israel. You don't speak about peace with Germany when the Germans are attacking all Western Europe. This is the reality we're in. Think about Churchill in his...
And even then, even if the Nazis were the ones, the German people were not necessarily the Third Reich's regime, okay? And this is something that historians are still trying to unpack to this day. But it's like, you got to remember that chances are, folks, if you grew up in Germany in the 1930s, 1920s, chances are you probably would have, I don't know what your stance would have been, but you probably would have joined the vast majority, okay? So you got to remember that, like, there's more to the story than just what a large regime, than the actual like mission statement of a large regime. Basically, there's more to the story than that. Way more, far more. And so this is where things get messy, because World War II was the Nazi regime was so bad in World War II, right? The Holocaust was such a terrible genocide, and it was kept secret for so long, right? So that's a big thing.
In his moment when all Europe surrounded, and he had to stand still and to say, no, this is a pure evil. First of all, we need to defeat the pure evil, and then in the future, we need to speak about future peace.
It's easy to say in hindsight that the Nazis were pure evil, but if you were a Western news media person in the 1920s or 1930s, chances are you probably thought the Soviet Union was more evil than the National Socialist, okay? People forget that. People forget that. So she has not done her history.
Everyone knows how
she has not read her history.
Attempts for peace were failed, and sometimes you need just to fight evil.
So that's that hindsight 2020 bias.
And Americans know this is.
And so yeah, this is
why they're projecting
the weird
so
part.
much support, and the British know this is why they're supporting us.
So 2 points I wanted to make here, right? So I think you will agree with me. That interview was sick, right? Someone saying that there is no humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Someone saying that if you're a mother, you must accept that we have to pound Gaza with 6,000 bombs over a 5-day period, which is what the Israelis have done, right? Completely ignoring the fact that there are also Palestinian mothers, there are also Palestinian children, basically saying that everyone in Gaza is a Nazi, right? These are incredibly extreme. This is genocidal language. And then she is saying at the end, and
by the way, this is how evil really spreads, folks. It becomes just fear-mongering on both sides, okay? The problem is that we don't really have a good war. Actually, we do. We do have one war in which you can really see how both sides have done some pretty nasty acts to one another. Obviously, I used the Allied bombing campaign as an example, but the British government was not doing a Holocaust during the war. But I think a better example. And I'm probably not going to make the comparison because people are just not ready for that. It's gonna be too biased, frankly. But you have to keep in mind that when you have both sides doing war crimes, you got to find an example that better fits that. And war crimes of equal proportion, by the way. They can't be uneven war crimes. They got to be of essentially equal proportion. And right now, I mean, the way both sides are behaving, it seems to be very similar. But World War II was odd in that, the only two governments that I can think of was the Third Reich and the Soviet Union. And both happened to be anti-Semitic, so not the best example. But both sides were in their own forms, anti-socialist in their own ways. And both sides did a lot to basically, they both had concentration camps. That's the best example I can think of. Both sides had concentration camps in the millions.
And the UK is supporting us. This is why we're being backed so profoundly, so enthusiastically by the West. And that's kind of the one part of the interview where she wasn't lying, right? It is true that Israel are being backed by the West, they're being backed by the United States, they're being backed by the UK. You've got this country where their official representative to the UK is speaking in genocidal language, lying outright, essentially, lying, especially when it comes to there not being any humanitarian crisis in Gaza. God, you have to be an idiot to not recognize that that's a complete lie. And she is saying, yes, and we have the backing of the US and the UK, and essentially that's why we feel so confident in this war of good versus evil. The second thing I wanted to mention is this World War II analogy, which keeps being put forward by representatives of Israel.
It's a totally different kind of war. The population sizes are totally different. Some of the technology has changed, but like the conditions, the initial conditions are just completely different.
Their supporters, which is to say, just as in the Second World War, you had to go into sort of a total war against the Nazis, we have to do that against Hamas. Now,
Don't want a totalitarian krieg. The Democratic Republics are not for totalitarian krieg. They're just not. The Soviet regime, on the other hand, and the Third Reich, the Nazi regime, both were, and they both mobilized for total war from day one, basically.
People have now reassessed whether or not the flattening of Dresden was proportionate, given how many civilians were killed.
He's using the
Separate from that, this is not analogous to the Second World War. Hamas are not analogous to the Nazis. And I don't say that because of their ideology. I don't know enough about Hamas's ideology to sort of say whether or not it borders on Nazism. But what I do know is their power, their influence. Hamas is an organization in an open-air prison which has, it's got more military capabilities than we thought it did a couple of weeks ago, but it is not an existential threat to Israel. Israel is the most powerful military in the Middle East, right?
Well, no, so that statement makes no dang sense to me, because they are an existential threat to Israel. They scared the F out of Israel, clearly. They scared the living F out of Israel. So
there has been this tragedy which has impacted many Israelis, and perfectly understandably, Israelis and the Israeli government don't want this to happen again. But that doesn't make Hamas an existential threat to Israel, like Hitler and the Nazis were an existential threat to Europe.
I disagree.
It's so clearly
a
misanalogy, and a misanalogy being used to say any means necessary we can use to destroy.
No, that's not
Hamas.
the answer either.
No, it's a bit similar to the language which was used by, some people who I think have made a call which is hard to justify when it comes to Hamas's actions, to say any means necessary. This is an occupied people resisting an occupier. Now, obviously, occupied people do have the right to resist an occupier, including by using arms.
Anyone who's willing to do that kind of level of violence, anyone who's willing to shoot you while you're kick you while you're down, no,
instead of music.
That's not okay.
Now, if you're on the side where you're more sympathetic to the idea of sort of Israel's security being the priority, yes, you might say
neither one.
Israel
I disagree
has a right now
neither one. Can I just pick a third option?
Gaza. I
besides,
that's questionable if they are an occupying force. But
besides
if you were to
like
take that position, I would hope you also take the position that they should follow the rules of law when they do it. Just as Hamas attacking civilians was a disaster, Israelis attacking civilians is also a disaster. But the Israelis don't want you to think that, and I mean, it seems like Western leaders don't really want you to think that either. They don't want the Israelis to think that either. Aaron, what did you make of that interview? As I say, it's not a fringe person, the official representative of Israel to the UK, saying that dangerous nonsense.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, on the World War II analogy, Michael, it's hugely interesting, isn't it? Because when, first of all, Chamberlain takes Britain into the Second World War, he leaves office in 1940, shortly before Dunkirk. He also remilitarised, he gets a very hard press, actually. Remilitarised Britain to a pretty extraordinary extent. He was the guy that signed off on Spitfires. So this idea that Chamberlain's a peacenik and Churchill was a wartime leader, I mean, we have that history because literally Churchill wrote it. And in terms of comparing Palestine, like you say, Mike, to the German war machine in the Second World War, probably the most impressive military ever. This is the Wehrmacht take over continental Europe in a matter of, 18 months? Even less than that. They rout the French army, at that point considered the world's most powerful. People don't really talk about this now. In 1940, the French army was considered the world's most powerful. They rout it in, I think, 6 to 7 weeks. So the idea that you're comparing, even Hamas, right? You don't need to talk about the Palestinian people, civilians, the people who are actually really suffering from that. Even Hamas. The idea that that is somehow analogous to the Wehrmacht, that is somehow analogous to one of the most powerful armies in the history of humankind, is so stupid, it would only be uttered by a complete idiot.
He clarified that pretty well.
It would only remain unchallenged on the British media. It is so stupid. It is so entirely stupid and so disproportionate.
You also got to keep in mind that Israel is not a very large country, so it doesn't take a whole lot.
Reality of the situation, it's just a normal, healthy person would just dismiss it as a person.
And again, they were dangerous enough to kill. Create a mini 9/11 for Israel. Okay, so it was enough. It was enough.
But, if it's BBC or
Sky or
LBC, it's
big enough.
Point, very powerful analogy there to the Second World War. Not every conflict is the Second World War, but of all the conflicts that least resemble the Second World War, this is it. And actually, I want to say this as well for people from the left. They've compared this in terms of Israel-Palestine to British and India, or apartheid South Africa. Very different, because in apartheid South Africa, you have an overwhelming majority of people are like South Africans. Or in India, you have I think 300 million Indians in 1945, when it approximately takes independence, really around the time of the Second World War. 300 million Indians, and fundamentally you have British service personnel and administrators in the tens of thousands, right? 100,000. So you cannot compare what is a
mistake.
You'd call this Israel a garrison state. It's one of the most militarized countries on earth. They're amassing an army of 300,000 people. Michael,
and
they only have a population of 10 million.
I just did the same mistake as I did in the last game.
That is like this country having an army of like 2.5 million people. They have nuclear weapons, and they're dealing with a non-state actor, which is making missiles and projectiles. The missiles that are being sent towards Israel apparently cost around $600 to make. Meanwhile, Israel has the world's most sophisticated drone manufacturing industry. Israel is the world's #1 sort of innovator in terms of manufacturing. So this idea that Palestine is analogous to the Third Reich and that Israel is analogous to the UK is so incredibly cretinous, Michael. I mean, in a way it's useful because you can just dismiss it and say, well,
so biased.
Serious,
so biased. That's only because Britain won that war.
I'll finish with this as an ancillary point. Who are they trying to persuade with that kind of logic? They're clearly not trying to persuade anybody sensible, right?
No, the conservatives.
What they are trying to do is go direct to the kinds of people who run this country, who only deal with historical analogies, who think everybody is Adolf Hitler Mark II, and are actually deeply ill-equipped to oversee foreign policy and geopolitics in the 21st century.
I mean, you could really argue that the reason why Nazi Germany even won that war was because the French army was just not prepared to defeat the German army. Had the French army even survived for just had they been able to stop the German Blitz, they would have been able to.
Thank you for joining me so much this evening.
Delay it for at least
and tomorrow you'll be joined by James Butler, who'll be making a very different outcome to the show.
Pretty sure.
Let's wrap up there.
We don't know if he would have invaded
Novara Media. Good night.
Russia. But anyways, yep. Still interesting video. There are some of my opinions. I'm trying to just put myself out there, folks. And so feel free to comment below. Feedback, criticisms is an open discussion. I ask that we just maintain everything. Please be respectful. Okay. Respect is the #1 thing, folks. Okay. Especially in such a sensitive environment where everybody's really sensitive. Please be respectful. Okay. You don't have to be friendly. I'm not asking you to be kind. I'm not asking you to be nice. None of that. I'm asking you to be respectful. Okay. That's all I have for today, folks. Stay safe out there and keep helping us create a better world, better society. Through, at the very least, keep helping the channels of communication between people, everyday people, stay open. So with that, thank you so much. Unless you want to watch me finish this game, but I'm going to keep playing. But I think I'm going to wrap up the video. It's been long enough. Peace out.